Dr. Riddle, we've been using some terms in today's testimony, small stock and weak stocks. Are small stocks all weak stocks, or is there a distinction to be made there?
I think that's an important distinction, that we tend to talk about weak stock management, and small stocks don't necessarily have to be unproductive. And really the issue is, if it's very small, it's at risk of a number of random events, whether it's fishing related or it's a habitat event or something. So small is at greater risk. A small stock, though, in particular lake, if it's depressed for some reason but has the capacity, it can still be fairly productive and sustain reasonable harvest rates. And it's a matter of how fast it would recover. So what you're really most concerned about is a small population in a relatively unproductive habitat. And that is at substantially greater risk than something that is just small but is also productive. All right, so weak does not imply that it's necessarily small and unproductive. It could be small and productive.
Okay. Sorry, small and productive would be considered a weak stock?
Well, it's still numerically small, so it still has a risk element.
Okay.
Right, some of the populations are quite small, maybe in a few thousand animals. And so an event, poorly timed, or a large fishery when they happen to be present, right, for no reason other than all the population was there, it could be severely damaged. So small is at risk generally. A small unproductive stock could just have cumulative effects over time.
Okay.
Right.
These questions are in the first instance directed to Dr. Riddle and Dr. Walters, and then I'll ask the other witnesses to add their thoughts. In 2004, a technical paper was prepared on behalf of the Pacific Fisheries Resource Conservation Council, and that is in the materials tab 1, CAN 002587. This document has been referred to periodically in testimony so far. It was authored by Dr. Walters, is the primary author, with Dr. LeBlond, and then Dr. Riddle as well. So I guess because it has been referred to already in the hearings a bit, I'm just going to cut to the chase a bit on this and ask the authors why this paper was written and what the outcomes, what were the conclusions that were reached in this paper. And I don't know which of the two of you would like to start on that question.
Well, maybe since I'm here, I can start.
Sure.
Carl can respond. Well, this paper has come up in a number of contexts, and I think we need to actually sort of put it in perspective as well, because this was written for a very specific question posed by the Minister of Fisheries. The council we're referring to is an advisory council to the Minister of the Federal Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and it followed from the 2002 Adams River return. And that actually is described very briefly in the document on page 15, paragraph 2. But the event of that year was that the run was returning at really above expected numbers. However, there were environmental conditions in the river that the in-season managers were expecting at least a 50% in-river mortality. And when the season came to an end and the fish were in the river, we had a good escapement upriver, and the en route mortality did not occur, and that the environment changed quite quickly. We had very good passage. I think mortality at the time, I went back, about 9% estimated. And so you had very substantial numbers of fish outside of the Adams and Shuswap Lake again. In 2002, there were protests there. The Pacific Fisheries Council actually was at the Adams River for the couple of the days of the protest. And so after that, we got the request from the Minister's office, really posed by their advisory committee. And the question was, responding to industry concerns, does overspawning lead to stock collapse? And that, so I think we need to keep in mind it was a very specific request. Because it was a response directly to the Minister's office, it was deliberately written. It's not a particularly technical document. It was technical in the background, but with minimal sort of detailed analysis involved. And it really was about long-term viability of the stocks. And that, so we really weren't talking about, we weren't asked to comment on harvest policy, and we weren't asked to really comment on appropriateness of fisheries policy or anything else. It was a very specific question. The conclusions, I think, are very simple in the sense that We did not find in 2003, when a lot of the work was done, that with the data from, what was it, 1952 to 2002 information, from 19 of the Fraser production stocks for Fraser sockeye, and that data is from the Pacific Salmon Commission at the time, Rivers Inlet sockeye and Babine sockeye, and 2 pink salmon populations on the coast. And based on that at the time, we didn't see any evidence that the stocks following large escapements collapsed in the sense of reduced long-term viability. There's no question that there's evidence in the paper about significant reductions in productivity. This is more of an efficiency of production argument. And there's also no evidence, as we went through the detailed records, about pre-spawn mortality and disease incidents. Those occurrences in the Fraser data system, which is very comprehensive for those, there wasn't any evidence that that was related to the density of the escapement on the spawning grounds either. There have been years of very high mortalities associated with disease, but they were not associated strongly with the abundance of fish on the spawning grounds. It was much more to do with the environmental conditions, and that's very consistent with a detailed paper written by Dr. Gilhausen at the PSC as well.
All right, thank you. Dr. Walters, would you add anything to that description?
No, Brian's done a great job of summarizing it. The only thing I would add is that in the light of the information that's been gathered since then, and particularly in the light of the Gilhausen paper that we simply overlooked, we didn't know it existed, I think we'd be a little more cautious in saying that that the downsides of overescapement are minor.
All right, so my next question was going to be whether the conclusions that were reached in 2004 are still valid today, and maybe we'll just have you comment on that, Dr. Walters.
Yeah, right near the introduction to that paper, we make a reference to the Ricker 1987 paper that Ken Wilson mentioned this morning, and it had estimates of over 100 million sockeye for the system back in the 1800s. Gilhausen took Ricker to task, and I went back and read through the original Ricker paper and redid the analysis, and that 100 million number is just crazy. It's just wrong. There's no way that there were ever anywhere near that many fish in the system during a period of historical record. We would have cited in Gilhausen instead, and we would have pointed out that a sock may get away with you may get away with a high escapement without any long-term impact, but if it's done repeatedly, it could lead to the kind of reorganization of stock structure that would produce this very violent cyclic pattern that was evident in the late 1800s.
Dr. Riddle?
Well, I think if we look at the paper now, then as we discussed this morning, the thinking has evolved a bit, and we do have even larger escapements to compare. So I don't think there's any question that we would say our conclusions now might be a little different if we included all that data. There were a few cautions.
And to be honest, we also made a mistake in completely overlooking the issue of delayed density dependence. We only looked for the immediate effects by plotting recruitment against spawning numbers of a high spawning number immediately on the progeny from those spawners. We didn't even look for the possibility of delayed effects on subsequent spawning runs. I think at that time, the statistical evidence that's been piling up in favor of the existence and strength of delayed effects just wasn't there.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree, but I mean, at that time, we didn't go back and do that assessment. In a couple of other papers since then, too, I mean, I think at the time, an important point is that we may not have had the contrast to really see some of these effects yet. We only really had a couple of really large years of escapements at the time. We actually pointed this out in the introduction because we were thinking at one point, well, how powerful would our analysis be to really look at long-term viability? We had years of data, but many of those years of data have been fished at fairly high rates, as we've discussed, and the populations had sustained themselves. But we've not had many years of very, very high levels of escapement. So there was a limited sort of contrast there, whereas now we have more data. The other thing I'd point out in the paper, I should have commented in the beginning, it's one of the few places where we updated the Fraser Lakes information on the abundance and size of the fry produced in Quesnel and Shuswap lakes from the Fraser Lake surveys. And that data is actually surprisingly difficult to get, readily available if you just phone and ask for it, but it's not widely published in that. And so I've actually got an update of that material too, if you wish to see that later.
I should mark this paper as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 417.
Sorry, and Dr. Walters, were you just going to add something else?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Dr. Woody, do you have any thing you want to contribute here in terms of whether overescapement can cause a collapse of the stock?
No, I don't believe I do.
Okay, and Mr. Wilson?
Well, I just observed.
Maybe I would add one point here, and it's in relation to Jim's work on the Quesnel system. Something else that we didn't have available at the time of the overescapement report was the fairly dramatic decreases in body size and survival rate of the Quesnel stock as it is built up. The stock started its off-cycle lines that are down just a few thousand fish. Started to grow geometrically back in the 1980s, and by the late 90s were up, not huge, but much larger than they were initially. And there was a severe decline in body size of smolts and a severe decline in survival rates. And an interesting feature of that is that decline carried through to the off-cycle lines as well as the on-cycle lines. In the older data, the big runs produced relatively small smolts, obvious competition effects. But as the decline progressed, even the little tiny runs for which there was plenty of food according to the plankton data and so on, those little tiny runs started to show suppressed growth and survival as well. And that indicates some really severe density-related or ecosystem-related carryover effects of some kind going on in the system.
Thank you.
Can I just point out that what Carl's talking about is actually in the document, right? So we can add a couple of data points, but if you go to the Appendix 1, the last page of the document, really, it's only the Quesnel 2002 that we've talked about. 2001 is exactly on the regression line relating the female escapement to body size, and you can now add a number of data points to that, and the trend is identical. 2002 is the only year below.
Except we didn't have the data showing the suppression in the off cycles.
This is the data that was available for all cycles in the document. If it's not in the document, it doesn't exist right now.
Well, Jim's going to publish it.
Well, it's becoming much more topical. I think that there's no question that we need to get that information out to the Cohen Commission, because you can't bring this up now to current time. And you'll see that the regressions actually are almost identical. All right, so it speaks to the sort of resilience of the lake systems, if you want. But the idea that the smolts are getting, not smolts, but the fall fry are getting consistently smaller is not true, actually, as we add the new data through the line.
Dr. Woody?
Yes, and just in relation to the graphs that are shown in the last, currently up on the screen, two problems exist. One is that these regressions are deficient in the sense that they include juvenile kokanee in the samples, that are collected in the lakes. Juvenile kokanee are smaller than the juvenile sockeye, and when you have an off-cycle line sockeye, the juvenile kokanee could easily dominate in the regression. So what you're doing then statistically in the regression is you're flattening out the regression line by the fact that you're getting small kokanee on the left-hand column, the near zero effective female sockeye. And so that's the first problem. The second problem is that when you're mixing all of the data, dominant line, subdominant line, etc., what I've found is that you actually have separate regressions fit to the dominant line and the subdominant line, and that the dominant line juveniles for given numbers of parent spawners are larger than the subdominant line juveniles, and that's your delay density dependent, and it's not being characterized properly in either of these regressions because you have the primarily in the quenelle, but the kokanee problem exists in both quenelle and Shuswap.
Could I make a comment for the commissioner about that very technical thing you just heard? The bottom line of this stuff, sir, is that we are dealing with highly fragmentary data that is questionable all over the place in its interpretation. We do not have sound long-term monitoring programs. We're relying entirely on historical accidents of population change to provide the data for us rather than any kind of real experiments. And there's no foreseeable end to that ambiguity. As far as I'm concerned, we will continue to be confused for a very long time unless we go out and do very much larger scale management experiments to deliberately push some of these populations around in abundance, a lot more than I think anyone's willing to do for management.
Mr. Wilson, I think you started to answer the question and then you got cut off. So
I just wanted to make the general common sense argument that when we arrived here and began our commercial fisheries, we likely found salmon stocks that were in pretty good health and more abundant than they are today by far. It seems to me that if over-escapement was such a serious problem, that problem would have been manifest when we arrived here. We would have expected to find salmon stocks in trouble because of the very large escapements that almost certainly occurred periodically prior to the onset of significant commercial harvest.
Dr. Woody, you had a comment?
Yes, just going back to what Carl is saying, there's two sources of information relative to the size of juveniles. The first is the actual juvenile sampling, and as I say, the main problem there is the need to separate the fish which are from kokanee spawners, that is, kokanee being landlocked sockeye, and which are small as adults and have small egg sizes and small fry. The separation of the kokanee is the first problem or first issue, but to get at the actual growth in the lake, there is a second source of information, and that is the scales of the adults coming back. And so that's what I used in the paper that we wrote regarding the cyclic dominance. The scale measurements from adults that return to spawn, and those are all sockeye, so we know that they're sockeye, and we can use those data for going back many generations further than the juvenile samples go back. So we do have some data here that we can use.
I asked, and I wonder if you could just address it. Oh, sorry, Dr. Walters.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've heard Ken Wilson say 3 times now, I believe, that there used to be lots more fish when there were lots more fish when white men arrived. The statement is simply not true. When the fishery first peaked up about 1890, not enough had been removed before then to have depleted the stocks substantially. And the stocks were not larger than about 40 million, what we predict to be the peak capacity of the system. And they were already cyclic. It is not true that there were hundreds of millions of sockeye and that everything was healthy until we got here and fished them. In fact, I think Jim Woody has pointed out that on average, the run sizes of the 90s are pretty close to the run sizes of the late 1800s. Run sizes before the fishery had had an opportunity to deplete the stocks.
And what's the information that you use to make that statement?
That's based primarily on the Gilhousen abundance reconstruction, and that is based on as soon as information became available in about 1892, which is pretty much as soon as the fishery became large enough to have serious impacts. Gilhousen was able to obtain fishing effort data, how many boats were fishing and when they fished specifically through the year. And he was able to calculate the harvest rates exerted by each boat, by each unit of fishing effort. Given those harvest rates, he could back calculate what proportions of the runs were in the catch, and therefore how large the runs had to have been.
And Mr. Wilson, where does your information come from?
Well, I'm looking at a reconstructed run. The source cited here was Pacific Salmon Commission. I'd have to sort it out exactly, but it's the same reconstructed database, I believe, that goes back to 1893.
That's true the Gilhousen database, basically.
Yes, it's true that the stocks were strongly cyclic, but every 4 years we saw an escapement that was comparable with the 2010 returns. So going back to 1890...
That's because all the stocks were on the same cycle line. If you move the recent Adams stock and horsefly and so on all to the same cycle line, you'll find that the peak is very similar.
I'm just making the point that with these very large escapements occurring every 4 years, you might have expected to see some stock collapse, but there doesn't appear to be any evidence of that in the data prior to Hell's Gate.
You don't expect to see what?
You would expect to see some stocks collapsing when you're seeing escapements of, very large escapements and runs on the 40 million range.
You don't think that having 3 out of 4 years having very low returns represents anything like collapse?
No.
Consistently 3 out of 4 being low?
Well, it may be that cyclic dominance is the natural state of affairs in Fraser sockeye. I'm simply making the point that very large escapements occurred every 4 years. Now, it may be a problem for fishermen, and it may be a problem from the standpoint of taking yield, but it's unlikely to be a problem for the fish themselves. I don't see the stock collapse as a biological problem. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about an arrangement that may not suit even commercial fisheries on an annual basis. But we saw strong, healthy runs, cyclic or not. And there's no evidence that those runs are in any sort of decline. The cycle, the dominant cycle seems to be strong and returning at between 16 and 39 million, based on Gilhousen's data. So it seems to me that if these large escapements were causing such difficulty, that some of those difficulties should have been evident during that time period and should be shown in the data.
They were evident in the 3 out of 4 years when poor returns occurred.
All right, I think we've got that point. The question I would like to ask now about this paper, the 2004 paper, is we've heard about how the work was done and why it was done. Does it remain today a valid tool for managers to use in assessing impacts of overescapement on stocks? Is it valid today to use the results of that work to assess whether a stock collapse may result from an overescapement? And I'll ask Dr. Riddle that question.
Is the paper still valid? I'm not sure that it's the correct comparison, I guess, in the sense that I would still draw the same conclusion about stock collapse. But we are going to add different cautionary notes, as Carl alluded to earlier, because we have more data. We've seen larger escapements and that, and we do now think that there are different models, much stronger inferences about the interaction between lines, certainly increased information about rate of loss of productivity at high spawning escapement goals, but as we've said in the beginning, that's largely expected to some extent. Are we seeing collapse where we're not getting recoveries of the stocks? No, we're still not seeing that, unless the notion of the delayed density dependence really continues to escalate. There's clearly a concern in terms of the trends in return in Chilco sockeye are perplexing, although they did much better last year in 2010 again. So it remains to be seen what happens after that. You know, and reading through it again carefully in terms of preparation for today, at the time I don't think I would have really changed anything. It needs to be read for the specific question that was asked, and that, as I say, it's not about fishing policy and that. But I think we would add more assessment. We probably wouldn't even do as very, what I said, as sort of a simple presentation now, because the Larkin analysis obviously requires more consideration of the interline interactions.
Dr. Walters, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, what Brian really said is one that I'd agree is we'd be a lot more careful today about our conclusions. We wouldn't be near as strong in saying what we said.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to move to another variation on this theme. Since management of Fraser River sockeye moved from the prior strategy that was used by the IPFFC to the focus on rebuilding and conservation under the rebuilding strategy in 1987 and then through FRISI, has that change in management strategy resulted in any negative impacts to Fraser River sockeye stocks? And I'll start with you, Mr. Wilson.
Well, by negative impacts, are we talking about negative biological impacts on the, the ecology of Fraser River sockeye, or are we talking about changing yield, the number of fish available for human use?
Well, why don't you answer both of those questions for me?
I think there's likely to be an impact of higher escapements on the number of fish available for harvest, particularly in mixed stock fisheries. I'm far from convinced that there's any long-term negative impacts on the populations themselves that result from high escapement. In fact, I've seen no evidence of it at all.
Great. Dr. Woody?
Could you rephrase the question?
Yeah, what I asked was whether there's been a change. We talked about this a little bit earlier too, that there was a change in management escapement policy and management strategies from the old Salmon Commission to the rebuilding strategy that was implemented by DFO in '87 and through to FRISI today, and since mid-2000s. Has the change in management strategy had any negative impact to Fraser River sockeye stocks?
Relatively, the management patterns are relatively similar, so we're not talking about differences immediately based on the 1987 stock rebuilding, but the harvest rates in some of those years were still fairly high, and it was because there was essentially a desire to keep the large stocks at approximately maximum sustained yield point. There was concern with the rebuilding of some of the other either smaller stocks or off cycles of large stocks, but we're not talking about the change to what is called for in the FRISI model, which would be a much lower maximum harvest rate.
Okay, did either of those strategies have a negative impact on the stocks in your view?
In some cases, there's been a positive response. I think the response of the Quesnel runs in the late 80s, early 90s, and so on, would have occurred regardless of any change in the pattern of management. The subdominant runs were building up and build up further in that time period. Some of the issues, if you look at the data and don't question them on Choco, those large runs that started occurring in the early 90s, or large escapements, were the result of some fertilization in some of those years. There were good responses to fertilization in some of the early 90s.
Dr. Riddle?
Well, I think if you look at the basic question in terms of what's happened over time, you would have seen a buildup. So there would have been a positive response through the initial escape and rebuilding program following, I guess that was the late 80s, that discussion, and then on through the 90s. When you've got to some of the very large escapements in recent years, as we've talked about several times already, there is evidence now of these interline interactions that could be seen as being negative. They will reduce the production that we're getting back, and so there may have well been a cost in terms of potential production of Fraser sockeye. Have they done damage to the stock? See, I don't think that you can say that in the sense that you've had lots of spawning capacity. We obviously have had good years return when we've got good marine survival, but you may, through some periods, have certainly been able to produce more fish if the density dependence starts to compound after the escapement goals. But I think any talk about negative impact on the stocks is probably not true.
Dr. Walters?
No, I'd agree with what Brian said. I don't think we can identify any serious negative impact on the stocks, unless it turns out that the system is reorganizing itself on a large scale across multiple stocks to go back into a more violently cyclic regime like the late 1800s. If that's occurring, there could be deleterious effects on a number of stocks.
And how would we know if that's actually happening, if that hypothesis is
Well,
valid?
the worst fear is if next year is a real bust, and then we see 2 more years of real bust after that, and then a real big run back. If we see the pattern of from 2007 to 2010 repeated again.
Next question is, again, on a different subtopic here. We've talked a lot about carrying capacity of lakes, and I would like to ask the panel if we know enough now about the carrying capacity of lake systems to fully understand the impacts of large escapements on these stocks. Like, do we have enough information now to do the work needed to better understand some of these impacts? I'll start with Mr. Wilson.
I don't believe so.
Okay. Mr. Woody, Dr. Woody?
We know a lot about certain of lake systems, certain Quesnel and Shuswap in particular. We need much more information on some of the other lake systems in the watershed to ensure that the decisions that are made in regard to escapement policy are taken with a good, clear understanding of what we're dealing with in terms of the productive capacity of the lakes and the interactions between cycle lines, the delayed density dependence issue. We have systems, lake systems that are likely undergoing fairly major changes as a result of the way the escapement has occurred. escapement levels have changed in the sense of the food capacity to rear fish. And I really think that the lake survey program needs to be revitalized, and it's been reduced by their financial capacity to cover more lakes. So it's right now the only lakes in the system that are consistently done are Quesnel and Shuswap, and we do need more information on some of the other systems.
Thank you. Dr. Riddle?
Well, I think I agree with Ken, but I wouldn't be quite as emphatic in terms, we know enough now to ask better questions. We know to focus on, we really can't address this freshwater issue without looking at the fish health. Some of the comments Carl's made about parasites, for example. We do need to look at some of the other lakes in terms of their dynamics. I think in previous sessions we've talked about what's going on in the Stewart Lakes. Well, we're not doing any work up there anymore. All right, so clearly to restore that lake, and Carl referred to it this morning, the statistic, it looks like we should fish them harder. I expect you'd have a hard time convincing many people that that's where we should go in Stewart Lakes right now. And that, so to justify that, you clearly want to do some work in the fresh water. And I think the big question is maybe we know enough to be a bit dangerous to think we know too much, and that, but we really need to do the ecosystem studies in each year. Again, we talked about this in previous sessions. Right now, we tend to sample in only 1 or 2 years when the dominant escapements have been there. So really look at the interactions. You need to actually do the study each year, and that has not been done for a number of years. And that, so I think I agree with Ken that we don't know enough. We have learned a lot by what we're doing, and that, but we still need to do more work, I think, to tie this down.
Given time is precious here, if you think you've already answered this question, please just tell me so. But do the TAM rules that are created using the Frizzy model, which has a 60% harvest rate ceiling, does that create a risk of over-escapement? And if you've already answered this when I asked the question about whether the harvest policies of rebuilding and Frizzy had any impact, then just let me know. But if there's a different complexion to this question, which gives rise to a different answer, please answer it. So do the TAM rules with the 60% harvest rate ceiling that come out of the Frizzy model present a risk of over-escapement? Mr. Wilson?
Well, from the yield perspective, I guess the biggest concern I have is that we put a cap of 60% on this aggregate with a buffer to protect diversity in smaller stocks. But what we don't allow ourselves the luxury of doing is harvesting fish in large numbers in terminal areas. So if you're convinced that a particular escapement is hazardous to the health of a particular salmon stock or CU, then certainly you might want to harvest it down in terminal areas. But part of the issue that's been driving this whole process is the health of smaller stocks and the protection of stocks that aren't producing as well. So the price we're paying for protecting weak stocks is, if you like, underfishing on the strong ones. By changing the structure of our fisheries, we could certainly address that problem, gain benefits in terminal areas, and still custom tailor the harvest strategy for an individual stock. That's not going to be easy, and it's going to require some changes in our fisheries, but at least many of the concerns that have been expressed here could be addressed to some degree through that style of management.
Thank you. Dr. Woody?
I don't have any comment.
Dr. Riddle?
Well, I think Ken has addressed it quite well. I mean, obviously, 60% sounds modest compared to past history, but it's substantially more on average than you've seen in the past probably 5 or 6 years anyhow. The question in my mind, though, is you really need to look at what are the triggers that would allow you to get to 60%, because there could be triggers that very infrequently allow you to get there. So I think you'd have to look at the whole agreement before I could really comment on whether it's going to contribute to overspawning. I just don't know unless you really look at how 60% would be triggered.
Dr. Walters?
So as I mentioned earlier, the most recent Larkin model analysis suggests we might ought to be fishing harder if we don't get continued poor marine survival rate like we've had. I think Ken's bang on in saying that the 60% is kind of a compromise. It intended to protect weak stocks and allow a reasonable harvest and so on like that. It's a poor man's compromise compared to a more fundamental change in fisheries management that permitted more selective harvesting of the stocks, wherever that might take place, up in the river or wherever. And as long as we're going to be operating our fisheries primarily as large offshore mixed stock fisheries, we're going to always be facing this nasty trade-off. We're always going to be facing whether it's worth saving a stock that produces 50,000 fish like the Cultus. If letting it go, we could catch 300,000 fish from the Weaver. Those are hopeless decisions. It's a hopeless trade-off. It's not surprising that the management system has come out with a kind of a compromise. It's not lose-lose for everyone.
Well, that answer leads me into my next question, which is whether protection of weak stocks like Cultus should. How do you balance the protection needs for weak stocks like Cultus against risks of over-escapement or productivity impacts on stocks that may have that risk where there's a high level of spawners released onto the spawning grounds? So how do we do that balancing? And maybe go to you, Mr. Wilson, to start.
Well, the whole issue of the value of biodiversity comes into this answer. I guess our observation over the last few years has been that some stocks that we felt were potentially quite minor stocks, such as the Harrison, have become very large and now produce substantial yield and benefits to commercial fisheries. It's my understanding that the world is in a state of rapid change and always will be. And salmon populations are in the business of adapting to that change and trying to survive. Biodiversity is the raw material that salmon populations use to adapt to change. Conditions change to favor one stock and to the disadvantage of another, and the stocks that produce the yield will change from time to time. But it requires a knowledge of the future that we don't have in order to make a decision a priori about which biodiversity we can afford to sacrifice in the interests of yield and which needs to be protected. So our approach has always been to try to maintain and even improve on what we have. If we can do that, then we're going to be able to win on both counts.
Dr. Woody, and if you can respond to the issue raised by Mr. Wilson as well, that would be helpful.
From our perspective, in harvesting strong stocks and protecting weak stocks, there's trade-offs certainly, and one cannot expect that you can optimize escapement levels on all stocks at the same time, and there needs to be an understanding that you don't manage the whole fishery for Cultus Lake sockeye. And in fact, Cultus Lake was doing reasonably well in the 90s prior to the onset of early upstream migration of late run sockeye, and that has thrown the whole thing out of whack. The monkey wrench and all of these low exploitation rates, or not all, excuse me, Brian, but low exploitation rates in the 90s are largely a combination of for marine survival, but then even when there are harvestable numbers of fish, the DFO's policy on late-run sockeye management has constrained harvest and led to some of these over-escapements that we've talked about.
Do you have a response to Mr. Wilson's point that we need to maintain all of the biodiversity we see in the system, that is kind of protection for the future in a changing world?
in terms of biodiversity as it pertains to sockeye stocks, the maintaining all of the cycle, the 4 cycle lines at high levels or is not a high priority from my point of view, because naturally I think the evidence shows that there's been years or periods of time when off-cycle lines have not produced well, but there's a biological reason for that. If we're going to maintain cyclic, if cycle line interactions exist and the cyclic dominance pattern is maintained, where your biodiversity comes in is the fact that you've got major stocks or major returns on at least one, if not two lines. You're not going to lose those stocks if one of the off lines is overexploited by the fact that a different stock has a dominant run on that line and is harvested at a high rate.
So you're saying where you have a mixed stock happening at the same time, one of those is on an off cycle, one of them is on an on cycle. If you harvest at the on cycle rate, you're not going to impact that off cycle on the weaker stock? Is that what you're saying?
I'm just saying that, yes, you would impact that line escapement, but if it is dominant on a different line, you've still got a major stock and, good health in the system. The sockeye, we say, are primarily 4-year-old fish at maturity, but a portion of their recruitment is at age 5, and those 5-year-olds get sloughed off from the dominant line to the subdominant and comprise, say for Quesnel, have comprised over 50% of the escapement on a subdominant line, and then their offspring come back as a high proportion of 5. So there's a direct relationship between the proportion of 5s in the escapement and the proportion of 5s in the recruitment. So 5s tend to produce more 5s, and so if you get a hole in one line due to overharvest, there will be a rebuilding of that by 5-year-olds that are coming from other lines.
Dr. Riddle?
Well, as Ken pointed out in the beginning of this, it really is a matter of trade-offs and how we set the objectives. We've also talked about inland fisheries where you have opportunities in some of these larger stocks and that. But, fundamentally, I suppose this gets back to the wild salmon policy discussion again. And it should be pointed out, I think, that the wild salmon policy does not require every conservation unit to be at the same level of status. And so you really can, through Strategy 4, that I guess we'll talk about later, this really is a matter where the people affected should be involved in the assessment and discussion and come to a best solution. You are going to have trade-offs in these values. Just the way Carl says, if it's out in the open and you have less certainty in your information, the trade-off's going to be even bigger. But this is the sort of thing that we anticipated under the wild salmon policy and how you actually meet your objectives for biodiversity as well as sustain fisheries. And add to that increasing requests for inland fishing. So this is really a matter of finding a way to get a process in place that can actually undertake these trade-offs and make the best decision within an open environment.
Process now that allows that to be done?
Well, this is the discussion about Strategy 4 of the wild salmon policy. We have processes involved. Do we have analytical processes where people can really work with some of the data? Carl's the expert in doing trade-off assessments, and he's done some nice work with in the Skeena drainage for what we call the independent science panel. We did do a structured decision analysis for how you conserve Cultus Lake coal, but that's an example of the process, but it was really a slightly different question in terms of what's the best combination of recovery tools at hand, enhancement versus predator removal and that sort of thing. You can do the same type of analyses looking at the contrast between the productivities of the different conservation units. But The other thing, I mean, as Jim has just said, there are opportunities between lines. When you're talking about conservation of genetic material, you're looking at a multi-year thing because you're talking about the genetically effective population, not just the census number in a year. And so there is a little cross-year mixing that does go on.
Dr. Walters?
Yeah, I guess I have to wear two hats in answering that question. As a biologist, I abhor the idea of losing these unique evolved genomes, like Cultus Lake. It's a very unique creature. But on the other hand, if I tried to empathize with or put myself in the place of a commercial fisherman, and over the last few years, he has to worry that he's lost something like half of his income, which is a very large price to ask anyone to pay to ensure the future of the Cultus Lake. It'd be very much like you going to your stockbroker and having your stockbroker tell you that you had to keep every stock you'd ever owned. I think you'd get rid of your stockbroker, wouldn't you? There is a very fundamental conflict of interest here between those of us who prize diversity for its own sake versus those who are having to foot the bill for the things we prize. We cannot objectively say that maintenance of biological diversity is necessary for sustained fisheries. We can very likely sustain fisheries forever on the Fraser just on the basis of its large stocks. And the Solval stocks that, like the Cultus, never will have the potential to replace the loss if any of those large stocks collapse.
What about this? What about the notion that we have had described with this theory that we need to maintain all the small stocks in order to create insurance for stock collapse, to preserve biodiversity for future changing environments? And we don't know now which small stocks could be the future of the system. Isn't it too risky to say preserve the big stocks?
In the first place, let me ask you if you would be willing to pay half of your income for an insurance policy, because that's what we're asking our commercial fishermen to do today. On the second thing, most of those small stocks could never be large. You heard testimony in the fall from two biologists, Holt and Hyatt, who spoke about the Cultus having the potential to be as large as the large stocks of today. Well, that's absolute nonsense. Cultus Lake at a little over 6 square kilometers could never produce the kind of numbers of sockeye that a big lake like Shuswap or Quesnel at 400 square kilometers is capable of producing. Our fishery and our economic future depends on those large stocks and their health, not on all the little cute stocks that biologists like me love to look at.
What about the idea that
we should not lie by pretending that they have some future economic value.
is Harrison an example of a small stock that has become big and economically viable?
Which has?
Harrison.
It's become big. That doesn't mean it's become economically viable. It's been able to become big because the harvest rates were low. It has not produced large catches. It's an example of a large unproductive stock. Now, you talked about small productive and small unproductive. Well, there's also large productive and large unproductive. It's not capable, as far as we can tell from its productivity, of sustaining high yields out into the future. It did not sustain them in the past.
What about the idea that Mr. Wilson put forward of fishing in the river and then being able to conserve stock like Cultus that's at the entrance of the river almost, but you could then harvest further upriver?
Yeah, if only our commercial fisheries had developed just about Chilliwack, it would have made a huge difference.
But
commercial fishermen would argue, too, that they have no right to fish there, that would mean a complete reallocation to the native fisheries. And they would also argue that the product quality declines considerably, and prices and economic value decline considerably as you move up into the river.
But leaving those economic arguments to one side, in terms of the biology, would fishing further up the river be one way of allowing the preservation or conservation constraint on a stock like cultus, while at the same time fishing harder on those runs that you would say need to be fished harder?
Sure, we could put in a couple of really large fish wheels just up, fish traps and wheel systems just upstream of Chilliwack and take all of the catch for the Fraser, while being very, very selective with stock ID methods and so on like that, and hand the fish out to people up in the basin, or sell them on behalf of the public or whatever. We could certainly reorganize the fisheries in major ways, like you say. I think the issue here is one of basic rights to the fish. Have the commercial fishermen established basic property rights to those fish? Should the public take away those rights? Transfer them to the First Nations fisheries that operate up in the river? To whom should the benefits go?
But
You have
those
panel of
Dr.
biologists.
Walters,
We are not the people to be asking these questions.
well, I was just going to make that point with you. They were asking you on the biology side today, and some of those issues you just raised are more of a policy type of discussion, I suggest. Before we leave, the last question I wanted to leave with the panel is whether there are any recommendations that you would like to leave with the Commissioner to consider in the inquiry. So I'll start with Mr. Wilson.
Well, Mr. Commissioner, I don't think we're going to get to a place where compromise and balance aren't important components of the management of Fraser sockeye. I don't expect that the world will be managed to maximize biodiversity, and I don't believe that we'll preserve every stock. But I think we need to take a balanced view of both the stock structure, the genetic differences between stocks, the importance of specific, often small stocks to First Nations and their rights and their harvest, and the interests of people that may consider salmon to be valuable for reasons other than their food value. So we're not going to get past compromise. I guess my concern here is that we seem to be trying to answer what is clearly a complex sociological problem that has to do with balancing all our various values. We're trying to reduce that down to a technical question that scientists can give us an answer to, so that we can go away and make our decision without dealing with the very complex problem of balancing everyone's interests. And I think that's what we're struggling with here. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Woody?
Mr. Commissioner, my view is that in some ways very much like Ken's, there's got to be trade-offs in the way the management of the fishery balances the biodiversity issues and harvest. But I guess I'll harp again on the issue of why we're sitting here in some degree, and that is that the issue of early migration of late-run sockeye is the biggest problem that we're facing, and has in some cases direct relation to the over-escapement that we've seen that has led to a substantial reduction of the quenelle stocks and possibly other stocks. And at the same time, harvestable, there's been some of that has been just as a result of the policy that DFO adopted in 2001. And somewhere along the line, I expect that you'll have heard that I made a recommendation about how to address the issue of the early upstream migration and harvesting summer run stocks, et cetera. That recommendation was for, I gather, number of reasons not adopted, but there needs to be a clear understanding that until we answer and work around that whole issue, much of what we could optimize here, on paper, isn't going to be practical, because we've got a policy that restrains harvest rate when on late run sockeye to some much lower level. 30%, I believe, or it was the target, maybe 35% in 2010 on a catch of Adams sockeye. And so very major numbers of Adams sockeye went upstream unharvested, and other stocks had equally large escapements. And we will be asking the question 4 years from now whether the 2010 run over escapements were, what the consequences of that were. We need more research on getting to the basic reason for late run behavior, and we need more investigation into options other than what the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has adopted as its policy, because of the impacts it's been having on the escapements on summer run stocks. So there's this early migration is the elephant in the room, as they said, and it's not going to go away when the inquiry is through with its report.
Now, Dr. Woody, I'm not sure if we were clear with you on that issue that you've just described. We did raise this with Mike Lapointe when he was here, but I wonder if I could just summarize, and you can correct me if I have it wrong, but the issue was that there was a higher harvest rate available on the summer run stocks in that year than there was available for the late run stocks, correct? Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that because the late run stocks migrated at a different time, there was an overlap? Is that the issue?
Yes, they had been coming into the river early and having high mortality rate that then led to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans developing a policy of lowering the overall harvest rate on late run sockeye to compensate for anticipated early upstream migration and mortality.
So that your issue isn't, that was did you agree that was a good decision, I take it, to reduce the harvest on the late runs because of the anticipated en route mortality?
The decision, in my opinion, was not correct, in that we can predict that the early upstream migrants, late run migrants, are going to suffer very high rates of mortality, and therefore to allow them to go upstream and allow the summer runs that are mixed with them to go upstream is a loss of yield and an over escapement on the summer runs, and at the same time not doing much in the way of solving the problem on late runs.
And why didn't it solve the problem on late runs?
Well, because those early migrants, which we're protecting, are going to die en route or on spawning grounds. And so we spent a pretty substantial amount of money on that whole problem, $3 million or something of that nature in research. We still don't have the answer of why they're doing that, but we can say that fish that enter the river, late run sockeye that enter the river prior to about the end of August are going to have an elevated mortality rate, and therefore policies that protect those fish are wrong-headed. If you wanted to do the best job of protecting the late run fish that are misbehaving, you would shut down fisheries in the marine areas and get as many into the river as you can, and then harvest those early upstream migrants, because they're going to have this very high mortality rate, and you could then harvest the summer run excesses. That doesn't mean, Brian, that we're going to harvest, we would harvest every late run fish migrating in the river in August, but the evolution, in my opinion, the evolution of behavior on the fish in different stocks in the watershed had been driven by the parasite that's killing them, and allowing them to go upstream is not really going to solve the problem.
Now, I
It's not
understood,
an adaptive thing.
I understood from Mr. LaPointe's evidence that there was an opposing view, which was that although many of those early migratory late run stocks would die, there may be some that wouldn't, and they would be very valuable from an ecological point of view. Those few that did survive and came in early, they may be very, very important from a long-term biodiversity point of view. What's your response to that argument?
My response basically is that in 2001, when we first had the workshop to try to develop a research program and identifying the causes of the early upstream migration, I presented a chart that showed Fraser sockeye, with one exception, spend 50 days or less in fresh water between entering and spawning. And for stocks in the southern BC, Washington, including Columbia River stocks, coastal stocks, spend 100 days to 190 days in fresh water without dying. So why do the Fraser's fish have very low short times in fresh water? Well, to my way of thinking, it's logical to expect that that has been driven by the parasite that has infected virtually every fish when they come into the river. And thus, trying to protect early migrants is really wrong-headed, in the sense that there's going to be a major loss of those fish, where so you're not getting yield out of those stocks, nor are you getting yield out of the summer run stocks that are passing through unfished at the same time. It's the big problem as far as I'm concerned, and I look at this whole issue kind of through that lens.
Thank you. Dr. Riddle?
Well, I mean, I hate to come back to science as a past scientist, because that seems to be what we always recommend, but I just don't think that we can afford not to address improved monitoring and continuing the science work, because just simply not putting the money is transferring those costs to other people. Whether it's First Nations in river that are not allowed to fish, or it's the commercial fisheries outside that have been substantially curtailed, other people are bearing some very substantial costs by us not doing sufficient monitoring and science. I would say that, well, we don't have direct answer for the late run sockeye. We've made some significant inroads in understanding the physiology of the animal, what's causing some of the mortality. That's not to say that we necessarily are going to be able to fix this thing. What I'm concerned about really is looking at the whole picture in a full context of in-season management. We've had problems with sustaining test fisheries. We're getting less information there. The runs are more variable, so if they're variable, you need more information from test fisheries, not less. All right, so the whole information system is going in the wrong direction, and that we need to do continued work on the mortality in river. It's got to be extraordinarily difficult for managers to sit in pressure-packed discussions in the peak of the season, and you have some estimate that might be that you're going to lose 50 to 80% of the fish moving up the river. Right? And we've seen years where that's been true, and we've seen years where that simply hasn't even happened. Right? So it's an extraordinarily difficult question to address in season. We probably can improve some of our forecasting for short time frames like that, but you're always going to have errors. And so that really after spending or really looking at what's a good investment of funds and how much, I think the next part has really got to be getting people involved in a better sort of planning process. The exercises that I was involved with before leaving are, yes, you have multiple stakeholders and you have discussions about expected returns, but they become so protracted that you really don't have discussions about what's an appropriate response when things don't happen the way you plan them to, because that's what really happens. We make lots and lots of plans about what will happen as the fish come in, and then they don't do it the same way. And so you're immediately in a very uncertain environment. You've got to make really hasty corrections. And to be perfectly honest, my opinion is that in season they do a phenomenal job. I mean, you really only have to look at 2009, 2010. Two totally different responses, and I don't think anybody would say that they were incorrectly assessed. Yes, you probably could have fished harder in the return in 2010. But again, you were looking at in-season mortality projections. So, I mean, we talked about W.E. Ricker before. One of the last papers he wrote, his advice was that fisheries managers should expect to be surprised, expect the unexpected, basically. And so it's a tough environment, and I think we're passing costs on to other people if we're not going to do the fundamental work to really examine things like Carl's now finding evidence out for delayed density dependence. Well, we don't know the mechanism. But I would say that the scientists involved now, with the tools that they have, are narrowing down what those mechanisms might be, and maybe we can do a better job in a fairly short period. But the serious concern I hear is constantly less funds, less fund, less fund. So you're more dependent on external funds, and that's highly insecure as well.
Thank you. Dr. Walters?
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce what Brian's saying, that we are entering a period where the next 5 years is literally anyone's guess what will happen. We could be entering a coho world where the declining trends in marine survival and survival rates at all life stages turn out to be not associated with delayed density dependence, but something more like has happened with coho, and we may end up with our fisheries shut down, as we have with coho for the last more than a decade. Or we could end up seeing a dramatic rebound. We could see strong release of a lot of strong delayed density effects because of low stock sizes in the last few years. Things could turn really good. The critical thing is not to have a management system that has become incapable of responding to those alternatives, and not to have a management system where the decision making is dominated by any particular narrow concern, like saving this stock or saving that stock, as it has in recent years. And I think one more a point I would make is that if the Commission is going to have anything to say about where the critical research needs are on sockeye salmon, I hope we've convinced you that probably the most critical needs and the biggest investment needs to be in the fresh water, not out in the ocean. Where the ocean these variations in ocean mortality seem to be symptomatic of problems that arise in fresh water.
Can I disagree? Partly?
I guess.
Really quickly, I don't disagree with the freshwater notion, but I really caution that we keep taking this jump from the river to the open ocean. And there's a little body of water called the Strait of Georgia that is very workable, and I think has much more to contain in terms of understanding what's going on. And so I really caution against jumping from river to ocean, and that I think river, yes, let's progress out from near shore to offshore. And a lot of the story, I think, is going to be in the lower river and estuary, Strait of Georgia.
Thank you.
Carl's smiling, so he probably disagrees again.
Maybe he's agreeing.
Oh, he's agreeing. This is totally self-serving, what you just heard.
They already know that.
Hearing a little recess for 10 minutes.